Welcome to the second of the series of the APWW 2020 webinar series. And we are very happy that today we have a very interesting panel of women who are representing the regions of the Asia Pacific. I am Luz Maria Martinez, and I am the head of the Secretariat for the Southeast Asia Women's Watch, Sea-Watch. And I am the moderator for this morning and also a member of APWW. So I'll tell you a little bit about how the process will be and the objectives for this morning. The objectives are to be able to provide an overview, a picture of how COVID-19 is impacting women in the region, to be able to look at how the Beijing Platform for Action can serve as a framework for analysis, as well as a framework for recommendations of moving forward under this new norm, creating a new norm. And also as a way to confirm and bring forth more women to share what your findings are in your communities, in your country, your experiences on this impact of COVID-19. We know that we really are just beginning this process. And in many of the countries right now, they are not being documented. So APWW made an attempt to try to document as much as we could. And so we have come up with 3 sub-regional meetings. By no means are they comprehensive or complete, but they are beginning to be able to document and share with you what our findings are in order for you to also continue providing some information back. And at the end of the webinar, I'll share with you where you can continue sending us information. So let me start off now with introducing, and I'll tell you how we've organized it. We start off with the Pacific, followed by East Asia, then Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And to start off the Pacific, I'd like to introduce Nalini Singh, who is the Executive Director of the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, and of course in Fiji. So Nalini, welcome, and please.
Thank you very much, Luz, and really appreciate.
Why don't we move ahead with East Asia? And I didn't tell you that each speaker has 15 minutes, and we will then have a Q&A at the end of all the speakers at the end of the session. So my apologies. It seems like Nalini, we were losing Nalini, and we'll come back to her. So maybe we can move on to Yukiko. Yukiko?
Okay. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the East Asian Sub-Regional Report. Actually, this East Asian Sub-Regional Report was drafted by Lutz. So today I am going to read the excerpt of the report. So therefore, first of all, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Luz, the author of this report, for her hard work. She wrote the East Asian Sub-Regional Report by combining information from published and publicly available sources for China and South Korea. For Japan, it is mainly based on JAW report written in May, so it's 5 months ago. So the information is a little old. The first, let me start with the overview of the sub-region. Government response to the COVID-19 crisis varied among 3 countries, that means China, South Korea, and Japan. China being the first country to experience the virus, it initiated measures of blockage and confinement, not only in the Wuhan region, but imposed it in the entire country to slow down the spread of the virus. In South Korea, where the government has been applauded, can you stay the one? Okay, the first slide is okay for now. In South Korea, where the government has been applauded internationally for their quick actions and for the use of digital technology. The Japanese approach to the pandemic is request-based, which asks people to refrain from going out. The flip side of this approach is the stigmatization of the infected. Despite the difference in responses to the COVID-19, there are common features in three countries in East Asia. The first, women are the frontliners of medical and care work in public and private spheres. They are the caregivers both in and outside the home. In China, for example, more than 90% of the nurses deployed to Wuhan at the highest of the coronavirus outbreak were women. In South Korea, women make up 96% of registered nurses. In Japan, women consist over 90% of nurses and almost 80% of care workers. All three countries also, all three countries have reported the increase in domestic violence, but I will explain about this later. The third, the countermeasures to the COVID-19 are gender blind. The gender blindness extends to the lack of gender disaggregated data at all levels of data collecting. One highlighted case of gender blindness from Japan is regarding to the emergency cash payment. While it is to be paid per person, the actual payment procedure is through a household head, which is usually male family members. This payment method has serious impact on survivors of domestic violence who flee from homes. In this way, the government's gender-blind measures hampered women's access to the money. The sub-regional report also found inequalities existing prior to the pandemic, such as gender segregation in occupation and gender pay gap, are exacerbated in time of crisis. Prevalent are the ingrained gender norms and gender disparities in policy-making processes. According to the article from South Korea, male-centered narratives and creating gender blindness, the male-centered narratives are creating gender blindness that contribute to suffering of women. It appears that male-headed governments are using war analogies that are addressing the pandemic from very male-centered narrative. This male-centered narrative ignores plight of women and contributes to the suffering of women, elderly, migrants, and those who most marginalized in the societies. The next slide, please. The second is about the category of key findings from the report. Among 12 areas concerned as Beijing Platform for Action, I cannot go each area, so due to time constraints, today I'll focus on the three combined areas. Number one is poverty and economy, including paid and unpaid care work. The second is violence and health. The third category is power and decision making. The first about women and poverty and economy. Both in Korea and Japan, women make up the majority of non-regular employees. Both countries report that women are more likely to be the first to become unemployed, and their contracts may not be renewed in time of economic difficulties. As we have known already, women are the first to be fired and last to be hired. Job segregation and discrimination also play a role, as many informal women workers work in areas that tend to be high risk of infection. such as call centers, health field, and care work, where they are less likely to receive safety consideration and protection. Care work, for the most part, has been low paid in an unstable employment situation. This field of care work is made up mostly by women. Both Japan and South Korea report that many of the caregivers suffered various difficulties to continue working and experienced income reduction from the onset of pandemic. The shortage of personal protection equipment and the lack of training for the pandemic are listed as difficulties that women face. About poverty, JAW report that single mothers have been the most vulnerable even before the pandemic. Their unstable and irregular employment position is contributing to the growing poverty that is more acute than normal times. The closure of school, nurseries, as well as children's canteen have made it more difficult for working women to work outside the home. The homeless young women are also a vulnerable group in Japan due to the pandemic. The young homeless women and girls lost a relatively safe place, such as an internet cafe, and they are at risk to be targeted by sexual offenders. The category of the is about the violence against women and health. All three countries have reported an increase in domestic violence, citing similar characteristics related to entrapment during the COVID-19 lockdowns, where women are trapped within their own homes with their abusers. Due to the halt of consultation services, the mobility restriction and social distancing make it difficult for them to reach support services, and this harder for the lives of women, especially for the trying to survive domestic violence. In China, for example, domestic violence nearly doubled in the cities after being put under lockdown. It is estimated that 90% of the causes of violence are related to the COVID-19 epidemic. South Korea reports that approximately 8 out of every 10 victims of intimate partner violence are women. Meanwhile, women's rights groups are working remotely, only able to provide telephone counseling, making it even harder for domestic violence victims to seek help. In Japan, the Gender Equality Bureau took measures to prevent and support for DV survivors by setting up 24 hours hotline and expanded services. As a result, it is reported that consultation cases increased 1.6 times in May and June compared to the previous year. Lockdowns are also increasing the risk of online and offline sexual abuse, especially among young women and girls. Health. The pandemic being the health issue has been shown that health of people is integrated with many other aspects of personal lives, and gender determine how women and men are affected differently, including the vulnerabilities and capabilities. The researchers in South Korea argue lack of gendered analysis has contributed to high rate of infections because government did not address the needs and issue of female-dominated spaces such as religious communities, public rental apartment, call centers, and nursing facilities. Nor did they take into consideration the health needs of the disabled and long-stay patients, pregnant women, the elderly, and the urban poor. The story is similar in Japan, where many of the elderly are women. The elderly find themselves at home without proper care of health services, as many care service facilities are either closed or offer limited services. The increased stress amongst caregivers and frontline workers, who are mostly women, impact on their mental health due to their direct physical contact with clients. The last part is about women in power and decision making. There appears to be low participation of women in decision making on issues related to the pandemic, both in South Korea and Japan. Although women are the majority of frontline workers, with few women as policymakers, lack of women as infectious disease experts, women are not playing a role in decision making on COVID-19. Missing at national level are also gender national mercenaries who are almost invisible in any decision making on the pandemic, except the measures to the voice survivors and as the JW report says. South Korea point to the gender blindness on addressing COVID-19 as a reflection of male domination of power in positions of decision making. While the first women director of Korean Center of Disease Control, Yoon Kyun-jeon, had been widely visible in the response, the policy process is dominated by male decision makers. All 17 provincial governors are male. Every key post of Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures headquarters is filled by male public officers. Women are still missing in the highest echelon of the party apparatus in China. Women rights activists attribute the ongoing gender discrimination and weak protection laws ranging from property rights to violence against women. The next slide, please. The third, engendering trends that requires further study. The first one,
Yukiko, you have 5 minutes.
okay, I'll go fast. About the human rights of women, the migrants appear to be particularly vulnerable in Japan and South Korea during the pandemic period. Migrants are reported to being vulnerable to job loss. Loss of job in turn affect their visa status, thereby falling into the category of illegal migrants. Immigrants. While South Korea and Japan have cash assistance for all and it may cover some migrants, there are obstacles of migrants due to language barrier. How much these issues affect migrant women is not known, as there are no studies in either country. BPS may lead to human rights violations. I'll talk about the GPS as well as digitalization. In high-tech countries of East Asia, there are concerns that use of personal information to counter the spread of COVID-19 is being shared and used by GPS, which may lead to human rights violations. Identifying people who are infected has led to public dominations of the infected, blaming them for spreading the virus. The disclosure of private information is often seen to affect the marginalized more. Health protection measures are instituted through the use of artificial intelligence with facial recognition systems. In China, for example, people's health is monitored through health code on the mobile phone. People are assigned a color code that indicates their health status that determines whether they are allowed to enter malls, subway, board on airplanes and trains, or check in a hotel. The risks online sexual abuse, especially young women and girls, are still continuing, and women in East Asia sub-regions and continue to struggle with the portrayal of women. Then so now we need the last point that the further study, we need to work on economic packages. At present, so far we have more discussed about health issues, but the world has been experiencing economic difficulties. Governments and international organizations are trying to activate the economy, even if it costs lives. This is the opportunity for us women to question the purpose and to propose what is economic recovery means for women, connecting our experience of the COVID-19. Can we transform the economy toward inclusive and sustainable and bring back better economy to achieve gender equality? We need to work more on this side. The last PowerPoint, please. The last PowerPoint, please. Example of what women are doing is we have a very much beautiful, interesting experience. Women often fill the gaps where government may fail to provide to address particular needs, while at the same time continue their advocacy for women's rights and women's needs. One example is a women's NGO in China, Weipin, held a live-streamed workshop on domestic violence. It's very important to let domestic violence survivors know their rights. The article says that, and the witness, we should all give them confidence and support. The advocacy of a women's group in Japan brought about a change in government's response to the pandemic on cash payment to survivors of domestic violence so that they can receive their part independently, not through the head of the household. Although this change is only applicable for survivors who left home. There are many other encouraging examples in the report. You'll find more from the East Asian sub-regional report when it is published. This pandemic, which has relied on women so much of the care work and where they are being left out of decision making, has pushed women to take multiple burdens while at the same time continue their advocacy for women's rights and women's needs to ensure that women's work is recognized and provided an alternative to social services that have been discontinued or limited. The conclusion at the end, the report report in summary is able to point out that for China, Japan, and South Korea, a major factor identified by the country is the gender inequalities that exist prior to the pandemic, and in conjunction with gender blindness, the countermeasures, these are exacerbated the response. In short, the paper shows that because of the absence of gender trends of address this pandemic, the effectiveness of the public health policies to alleviate suffering is compromised because it does not recognize nor address the suffering of all unequal measures. So I'll finish at this point. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Yukiko. Thank you. I think just very quickly, one of the points that Yukiko made that is very interesting is, and we are seeing probably in other regions, is how gender inequality and gender blindness now combined together is really creating much suffering for women it's particularly in East Asia, and addressing the most vulnerable, the single mothers, the homeless, the migrants, the older women, the frontliners, women who are very vulnerable in the current condition. And I think Yukiko left us with a question, which is very good, which is, what does economic recovery for women look like? And so women are not being asked this question from the governments as we move forward. Please put your questions in the chat box. We are collecting them. You may have different questions for the different speakers. And so we would like to now move back to Nalini. Nalini, for those of you who may have just joined us, Nalini Singh is the Executive Director of the Fiji Women's Rights Movement. And Nalini, please, next.
Thank you, Luz. Can you hear me?
Yes, good, yes.
Okay. All right. Just needed to change my internet connection. So if Carol can share back the screen, thank you very much. So as you can see on your screen, the vast blue, the vast blue Pacific, as we call it, and therein lies, if not thousands of islands that make up many different island states in the Pacific. So you see three subregions being defined: Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. And therein lies further complexities because these subregions are defined based on the geography or the geographic character of the different islands, the ethno characteristics of the people, and within the subregions amongst the various countries, there lies the diversity of language, culture, practices, moving into modern times, different types of leadership and governance, the different ways in which our economies have evolved. And so this is the backdrop to how the pandemic has hit us, with Australia and New Zealand also in this oceanic region, coming in as two countries that contribute a lot to the Pacific in terms of the various countries that rely heavily on the tourism industry, and also looking at providing work for a lot of Pacific Islanders, and as such, there's a heavy reliance on the two countries. However, there's marked differences between Australia and New Zealand and the rest of the Pacific Islands. Australia and New Zealand, by feminists, we consider both as global North countries in the global South. If we are to talk about the developed state. So as you can see, it's not an easy task to be presenting some sort of a summary in a report or even in a conversation like today on how COVID has impacted us across the vast Blue Pacific. And we can see that through the expanse of the ocean, we see that this region is a home to many different countries and territories with diverse indigenous cultures, esoteric creation stories and histories, societal norms, languages, religions, beliefs, and traditions. And because we have such a depth of diversity, the very Western scholars and colonizers divided us into these three different lots based on the characteristics. So if we move on into looking at our background, I think we cannot overlook the fact that various parts of the Pacific were colonized by many different countries. We've had the British, come in. We still have some French territories. We have German, Spanish, and Japanese, even the Americas, coming in at various times of our history, and that has left significant marks of how we are developing at the moment. As COVID has sort of hit the Pacific. There has been a range of contextual challenges, and some of it many of you would be familiar with. Um, at the backdrop of this all is the struggle that we have with the ongoing challenges of climate change and the kinds of disasters that we are seeing, and then to have COVID-19 come in with all the challenges that we have in terms of what Yukiko talked about, gender equality. I'm putting that at the backdrop because the Pacific is deeply patriarchal and conservative, and the equation around lifting women and girls in all their diversity out of very unbalanced scales when it comes to gender equality, it has taken us decades of work, across in the Pacific, with very I would say differential type of results that we have seen. So with Australia, New Zealand, Fiji being a lot more progressive in the sense that we are looking at substantive um, contributions. We have legislation, a plethora of policies, etc. But as a region, we still have a lot of systemic discrimination and extremely high rates of violence against women. So this, coupled with the fact that we don't have enough women in leadership, if you're looking at parliaments, the Pacific stands at the lowest. If you look at the IPU rankings, we are at the lowest at the moment. Fiji has 19 women in parliament, and perhaps with the recent elections in New Zealand, we are yet to see how that is going to further tip the scales. But that's how the backdrop of this is. And as early January, when the WHO announced COVID as a pandemic, immediately countries like Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, and other states closed borders and recommended that their citizens return to their countries and to be, start some semblance of quarantining of those that were returning or coming into the country, and we're putting in various risk management strategies for COVID-19. We have to remember that in the Pacific, around about the end of 2019, we also had the outbreak of measles, where in Samoa, many children had lost their lives. And so with this COVID-19 pandemic reaching our shores again, it meant for countries like Samoa to, go back into very high alert. And because they had just experienced many deaths due to measles, they did not want to go through all of that again. With Fiji and other countries as well, we were on high alert because of that situation. So the protection mechanisms, the closure of borders, restricting movements within the country or within certain areas in a country, restricting entry of foreign nationals, etc., allowing certain workers to work from home. In Fiji and in many other countries, I see, we have curfews. Schools have been closed, community events have been canceled, churches, and all of that unites us as a people. They've all been stopped. So, life as we know it has also been, quite impacted. So, and as for those countries that were heavily reliant on tourism, well, it's totally decimated that sector. And one of those countries is my own country, Fiji, where there's a heavy reliance on tourism, on the tourism industry. And what has happened since early this year is, yeah, we've had no tourists come in, or very few, those who can afford to travel through them by their own yachts, etc. But there isn't any. So that has meant a significant number of those that are employed in the tourism sector are now without jobs. And we have to remember that in the overall backdrop of women forming a majority of those that work in the lower paying jobs in these sectors, and they are the ones who are most affected. And of course, in the other informal economic sectors linked to tourism, they've all been affected. And so that has meant that the interlinked nature of women then facing more violence at home, they have, the burden of increased burden of unpaid care work. In some cases, we hear of their partners and husbands, pushing them out of their house so that they become the ones to go look for food, etc., putting them into direct threat, of infections while the men stayed at home. And of course, in cases where there were ongoing violence in homes, being locked in with perpetrators was not a very good situation. So knowing that in any disaster situation in the Pacific, very prone to disasters quite frequently through the devastating tropical cyclones we experience, we know that women and girls are disproportionately impacted. Members of our LGBTIQ community as well, the disability, those that live with disabilities, they are also disproportionately affected. And we knew that as soon as the country went into lockdown or put on the safety measures, we knew that the situation was going to worsen for those that were reliant on some sort of social protection measures. I'm not so sure about the rest of the countries, but in Fiji, we know that this has been a real test of how strong our social protection measures have been, and how effective, or I would say how compassionate is our government when it comes to looking after those that would need the most help. And I have to say, in both fronts, it has been quite lacking, in the sense that the government response has been very lackluster and uncompassionate. And for in terms of our social security plans, well, they have been stressed. There has not been injection of increased budgets, etc. And so, we do not see a lot of help coming in from government. We also have to realize that in the Pacific, most of us, we live in a very communal way of life. And in this way, we see that through some of our practices, we might be, exposed to the virus, or there could be higher risks. And the way in which, some of our governments have reacted to this has been, we should say, contrary to the spirit of keeping us safe. But we have never experienced, and well, I guess in modern times, something as severe as this in our region. Measles, yes, we've had that, just last year, but on the scale of the way in which COVID-19 was spreading, and the fact that we do not have vaccines or any cure, and the fear that has been generated, has affected that way of life. And in some communities there has been a lot of stress, anger, and distress caused. So I guess if we are looking at so what around the specific issues in relation to human rights, I think when we went into lockdowns and the various restrictions were put into place, Fiji, for example, declared a state of disaster. So that meant a lot of restrictions were in place. We still have curfews. We fortunately do not have community transmission, as does a number of other countries in the Pacific. We do not have community transmission, but we do have one case as a border quarantine case. So we have to weigh, we're constantly weighing as activists and human rights defenders, we're continuously weighing, where are we looking at in terms of, say, for example, the way in which government wants to say, do contact tracing, like where's the borderline between contact tracing and surveillance? And where would we then, actually call out government? So in relation to curfews, we are looking at, thousands of people, including minors, being arrested for violating curfews because they're not absolutely sure about, whether playing group sports outside, could be violating social distancing rules, or going out because you wanted to get some medicine from your neighbors and it's beyond the curfew hours and you're caught by police. Knowing your rights to ensuring access to justice is meted out in a way in which we have the processes and the rights for those that are sort of arrested. All of these are being severely tested at the moment, and we can see that in terms of how this impacts women, that if we had a case of women not being able to access justice in the way that she should be, before the pandemic hit us, it has worsened the situation now. So a lot of what we see in relation to the critical areas of Beijing Platform for Action, and how COVID has impacted it. I think Yukiko touched on a lot of that, and it resonates here in the Pacific as well, which I guess is tantamount to the fact that women across the region and perhaps across the globe are experiencing similar or setbacks in terms of looking at how the critical areas under Beijing and how has the pandemic sort of intersected to make the situation worse. What I would like to say here is that as an organization working at the national level and looking at state commitments and sort of holding states to account on these commitments, what I can say quite clearly is that decades of work around moving laws and policies, etc., to a more progressive response to to the issues that women are facing. The pandemic has put a spotlight on all the cracks and fissures that were there. So when we are talking about poverty, we are talking about linked to poverty is social security, social protection. When we are talking about women in leadership, where are the women? If they're not on the table before, well, they're not there now. And all these decisions are being made without women. Education and training, we can talk all we want about online classes and technology, etc. But when we have the Pacific, as I showed you on the map, small islands scattered throughout a vast expanse of ocean, and each country having, different ways and systems, how are these communities all meant to be keeping up with, you know, these technologies that are being promoted by, I would have to say, you know, the UN and other agencies, in terms of saying that, you know, to avoid the disruption to the learning cycle of girls, so, and young women. So, you know, I have to say that, you know, health, as Yukiko talked about, not only women who in most of our countries comprise of, you know, a significant proportion of those that provide the front line healthcare services. But, you know, when we flip it over and we look at the situation of our public healthcare infrastructure and the quality of services being given, you know, it is not able to cope even with what the regular services they were supposed to be providing. So there's the stresses that COVID has put on the infrastructure, as well as those that are essential healthcare providers. You know, if this continues for a bit longer, we will see some serious outbreaks of other diseases. In Fiji, we have already had many deaths from leptospirosis, from other communicable, other non-communicable, communicable diseases, whereby it's a matter of, you know, hygiene and sanitation coming into place. And our healthcare is not able to cope with those because we, you know, the shipments and the flights are reduced into the various island states. We don't have medicine. We don't have the various equipment needed for blood transfusion. All of these things are coming into play right now. And in my opinion, it's the situation that we are in is only going to worsen what women are experiencing. If I flip this and talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights, women had very little agency to controlling their body and bodily autonomy. In the crisis situation, in the pandemic situation, where men who would have either lost their jobs or be on reduced time and pay, they're spending more time at home, you know, are demanding sex. They do not have access to contraceptives. What we will see in the next few months is a baby boom. And, you know, my worry then is that with families that are not able to cope at the moment, what is going to happen when there are more mouths to feed? There is, contrary to what we were experiencing before, the rural to urban drift, now we are seeing urban to rural drift, where people are moving back into their communities. And there are some reports of stresses in their communities where, you know, now the traditional family units are being put back in together. We have the elderly and those that have remained in the communities bearing the brunt of trying to provide for people who are returning home from being in the cities for decades, and claiming rights to land, to farm, and you know, grow their food. The stresses are appearing now. And I guess in the last few points I'd like to raise is, you know, violence against women. It has been an integral issue. And as the pandemic came into the Pacific, we knew through the work that the various crisis centers who provide essential services, we knew that there was going to be spike. And that's exactly what we saw across the various countries that have, you know, dedicated services for women that were experiencing violence, that there was indeed an increase, for example, in the number of calls helplines were getting, because women wanted to know, you know, where to get services from in a situation of a curfew or lockdown, etc. They were trapped in with violent partners who were monitoring phone calls. and all of those things. And we knew that the police services that were being provided were going to be overstretched. And so what would that mean? And often there is that gap between the services that the police provide for women. And we saw in this case that that was happening on a regular basis, that women's calls were being taken, but the services in terms of police providing safety protection was not being given. So that was a worry for many of us.
Nalini?
Fiji, yes.
Okay.
So Fiji, as with many other countries, have a lot of our workers working in Australia and New Zealand, and there's a heavy reliance on remittances. And I have to say that if we are talking about the economy, and I've talked about how the tourism industry has fared, but with remittances not coming in now, many of our countries are facing a lot of difficulties because either because of the travel restrictions between countries, and if the workers are already in Australia or New Zealand and other countries, and they are under lockdown and unable to get to their workplaces, then of course they are unable to earn an income and send it back. So that too, it has been a one of the major, I would have to say, impacts in relation to the economy. And women, young women, girls, in the conversations with, at least through my organization, in trying to see how are they coping, we know that many have said that their burden of unpaid care work has increased. Young women and girls have had to make decisions in terms of whether they continue their education or contribute to their families' livelihoods. And that's devastating in terms of looking at how far the women's movement had come across to ensure that all women and girls have access to quality education, which leads to quality employment. And to have a pandemic come in, and then to see all that work that has been done over decades decimate, for so many different reasons, but mainly because the patriarchal attitudes that still exist and are very entrenched, and the ugliness of how that is manifested is coming out at this very time. So Luz, I stop over here and say that there's so much more that we do need to study. And we have various reports that have come out from the Pacific with a lot of statistics and data. And we have many different discussions happening at different levels. And, but unprecedented times have meant that, we are, at a moment where we ourselves don't know when this is going to be going away, or when will we have a cure or vaccine, because in my opinion, the worst is yet to come for countries like mine. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Nalini. You actually brought in many of the issues that have been discussed in the various areas, and the intersectionality or interlinking of the 12 critical areas of concern and how they are still very relevant, and even the interaction or interlinking of economics and violence. And you have contextualized the pandemic in the context of a disaster, in which that is what it is, right? A disaster. And so how the Pacific, along with the other disasters that are related to climate change, are struggling now with this health disaster. So thank you for that. You did bring in many of the connections that that other regions, especially even East Asia, pointed out, those inequalities, and how the pandemic has really put a light on these inequalities. So thank you. Questions are coming in, and I really appreciate that. And so we'll have some time to get to them in a little while. But next, let's move on to Southeast Asia. And I would like to introduce to you then Aurora de Dios, who is the Senior Project Director for the Women and Gender Institute, WAGI, in the Philippines. So, Oi, please.
Hey, yeah, good morning and welcome to every participant who's with us today. Yeah, I have a PowerPoint, Luz. Yeah, can you flash that? Yes. What I'm going to do is simply to outline my presentation according to the points that Luz mentioned. One is to give a little overview of the region, the situation in the region. Second is to look at some of the key findings so far, no, based on the data that we have, and then look at how what are the trends that are emerging from some of these reports, and lastly, to look at what are the responses of women's groups. It won't be very extensive because of time limitations, but we're continuously getting data in order for us to update our presentations. But just as an introduction, I think we all agree that prior to the COVID, we've had NGO reports that have been written by NGOs, and they're out. Some have been published, some have been submitted already, and the general picture that we see is that we're far from achieving many of the goals that the Beijing Platform for Action have actually set out 25 years ago. And before we could really reflect and analyze what these findings are, we have experienced all over the world another element that puts, an additional layer to our analysis of the situation of women that has in fact exacerbated the kinds of inequalities and discrimination that women have faced so far in the last 25 years. As you can see, I start off with looking in my attempt to look at how governments responded to COVID. I've tried to put some of this data together in a matrix. But just before I start, I'd like to point out that Southeast Asia has one of the highest incidents of COVID-19. The Philippines alone has around 300 plus, but the highest rate is in Indonesia, and I think the lowest might be in Singapore. The data keeps changing by the day, but suffice it to say that because of the transmission rate and the infection rate in the region, many of these governments have employed quite a bit of. So I look at the policy and then the control mechanisms that they have put out. I cannot put everyone in, but just to look at the first, can you put it downward, please? Yeah. So the first one is the Philippines here, up this part, and yeah. So for leftmost side, yes. So we're looking at the Philippines. Can you please? Yeah. Okay. A little bit on the left. It's a bit. Yeah. No. The first one. Just the first one. First slide, please. Okay, in the first slide, you will see that I have put together the name of the leader and the country their approaches to COVID-19 and the control measures. Now, this is to just give you an impression of what's happening in the region. Can you make it smaller so that people can see all at once what's in the... So yes, that's right. So as you can see, the approach has been quite restrictive and reactive. So almost all of the countries have declared emergency measures, state of emergency. But in addition to that, many of these governments have imposed or have taken on the approach of providing additional powers to the already powerful positions of prime ministers and presidents. This is true of Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, Joko Widodo of Indonesia, Hun Sen of Cambodia, Prayut of Thailand, and Myanmar, no? And Malaysia, I didn't quite get the latest here. So this is very significant because even before COVID-19, we've had trouble about dealing with Southeast Asian governments that tend to be authoritarian and militaristic. The fact that we have this COVID pandemic for 7 months now, and it can last for another year, is that it gives an opportunity for these authoritarian governments to be given the kind of space to even provide restrictive control measures that are already in violation of the freedoms and human rights of the Southeast Asian people. So as you can see, the control measures are almost always lockdown, quarantine, curfew, closure of public places. But in addition to that, you have what we call red tagging and the introduction of laws such as anti-terror and the closure of media organizations that are critical to the president. The same is true with Indonesia, in Cambodia as well. And in Thailand, we know that there is a political unrest. So the emergency power of Prayut is now being used to censor as well as to repress and detain people who are against the Thai government. And Myanmar is also out to have emergency measures that seek to arrest and punish those who are spreading disinformation and starting what they call political unrest. So if we go by each of these countries, the additional controls and mechanisms imposed in response to COVID is in fact strengthening and adding to the authoritarian measures that are already in place. No? And for this, because of this, I think that what would have been a public emergency response is also doubles up as an authoritarian and repressive control of the citizens. So maybe you will get this slide. So can we go to the next one, please? Next slide, please. Okay, make it smaller so that I can read. So I've selected some of the areas of Beijing platform, but I've not been able to include all of them. So the first, can you make this small? Yes. No, the previous slide, please. Okay. So as we can see, what is already a very problematic situation for women, in that they are, very, very affected by economic policies, liberal economic policies that have marginalized them and deprived them of their economic opportunities. With the other layer of COVID, we see a deepening of poverty amongst the marginalized and the poorest of the poor, who are dominated by women. And added to that is the economic disempowerment that comes with this deepening poverty. So, for instance, lockdown keep women from earning a living and supporting their families. Second, the care work burden of helping to sustain the family at a time when there are no jobs, caring for the elderly, for the children, and even now, women are required to tutor their children, help them out in their educational duties, which are digitally conducted. Job losses of migrant women, which we have seen in the Philippines. We have something like almost 400,000 migrant workers coming back with no jobs, mainly from the Middle East and other ASEAN countries. And the lack and absence of economic activities in those sectors that are dominated by women, such as the informal sector and the service sector. And all this situation combined is aggravated by the lack of or absence of economic assistance, particularly to vulnerable sectors. And this is quite a problem with the little social economic assistance that's being given. Women are doubly victimized because of the inefficiency, the corruption, and the delay in granting those small amounts of financial assistance during COVID. Next, please. Now we go to the area of violence against women and human rights violations, which are quite connected. Um, Already in Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, and the other ASEAN countries, there has been a significant increase in the incidence of domestic violence, rape, and sexual harassment. Uh, and the problem here is that because of the lockdown, many women are prevented from reporting and accessing services, which are sometimes also in lockdown. Like, for instance, courts are closed. They have recently opened digitally. And also, helplines as well as vow desks are not able to give timely assistance because they themselves are restricted from moving around. Women, we have documented, at least in the Philippines, a lot of sexual harassment cases and violence, as well as extortion in quarantine areas that are subject to police control and scrutiny. A special problem that we have seen is the lack of attention or absence of attention of women in prisons and institutions, because these are the most congested area, and the risk of COVID transmission is very high, and the lack of health services on COVID is aggravates that kind of situation. For migrant women, many governments, including the Philippines and Indonesia, are just overwhelmed by the sheer volume and magnitude of migrants coming in, or women trying to get out to get work. And we have situations of thousands of stranded migrants who are uh, supposed to get their COVID tests, but have to wait for weeks. And added to that is the inability of the local communities to absorb them back in the provinces. Next, please. The issue of education is been complicated by the fact that no face-to-face education in schools are done in many areas of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines. And this poses a serious problem, as the digital divide digital divide, to start with, is already a problem for women, because women are left out because of lack of knowledge of technology, as well as access to internet services. With COVID, you practically have a situation where you leave thousands of women and the poor behind. No, UN says no one should be left behind. Well, this situation, the reality that we're facing is that women and children and the poor are left behind. Mainly by the shift to technologies that are out of reach or out of their capacity. So the shift to digital mode of education leaves out millions of children of poor families, indigenous people, from availing of educational opportunities. So inadequate technology support for teachers, who are mostly women, and parents in vulnerable communities and far-flung areas are unable to help their children because they themselves are not capable of handling the technology. Plus the fact that they have no resources to buy laptops or even just internet connection. Next, please. Okay, what about the health and reproductive health of women? I think Nalini mentioned that the lack of reproductive health services, which are inadequate to start with, compounded by the restrictions and negative attitude of the church, have posed serious problems for women who cannot avail of such services because of the lockdown and mobility restrictions. And we foresee, and many have already foreseen, the Population Institute of the Philippines, for example, have already predicted the highest rates of uh, what do you call this, teenage pregnancies all over Southeast Asia, and the highest of which is now in the Philippines. The COVID situation, pandemic, has uh, increased the stress level and the anxiety level of women, thus making them vulnerable to mental health issues because of the lack of resources, the lack of food and nutrition, and the inability of government to give them timely assistance. So all of this really results in a very unhealthy situation where women and men are driven almost to suicide and to starvation, and the simply trying to survive from day to day. The other aspect of health, I think, that we notice is that medical workers, who are again mostly women, our nurses, are at constant risk of COVID transmission, but are not adequately supported in terms of the protective gear, in terms of their accommodations, transportation, and monetary assistance. Next, please. So what are the emerging trends that we see in COVID? I've kind of outlined this because I don't want to waste a lot of time on the presentation, but we welcome your questions later. So we see an increasing government militarization and securitization of COVID-19 pandemic, and increasing control of people's mobility and freedoms. So this is what I would like to stress, that the pandemic is not just a health issue, it is a security and a political issue for the citizens of Southeast Asia. Second is that while the people are clamoring for more assistance in trying to address the pandemic health-wise, the response of the government alongside the emergency measure is to intensify repression of media, civil society, and opposition groups, including women's groups critical of government policies, through anti-terror laws and policies. We've seen this now in Thailand, in the Philippines, and also in Myanmar. And for women specifically, there has been an increased incident of vow, discrimination, and stigma of migrant refugee women, as well as health workers. And lastly, I think this is my last, is what has been women's response to COVID-19. By that, I mean women, organized women, or women in their communities. So two things. What I have seen is there's so much outpouring of assistance coming from individual women, organized women, civil society groups for humanitarian assistance, because this is the first order of the day. People are getting hungry, they're starving, there's no work, and government is unable, inadequate to respond to these critical needs. So humanitarian assistance, including food rationing. Women have been scrambling to put together their resources with businesses, small businesses, as well as medium-sized businesses, to provide timely assistance to health workers and to poor communities, including medical assistance. And lately, organizations such as Dawn and many of my organizations in the Philippines are providing psychosocial assistance to vulnerable sectors, including migrant women. And the second very important trend that I have seen, which is to me quite a significant response of women's groups, is to join the movements against authoritarianism, dictatorship, and for women specifically, to combat misogyny, as well the exclusion of women in decision making, that impact on them in COVID-19 pandemic responses. We have seen in the first matrix, shall we go back to the first matrix? Shall we go back to the first matrix? Yes. That we have seen also the preponderance of military figures in conducting the emergency measures, anti-COVID-19 measures. So this is the pattern that we see. Almost all of the governments are emergency or COVID-19 task forces are led by military people. And so I think we've wanted to put more pictures here, but we have no space for that. But just to say in conclusion, that Southeast Asia is experiencing one of the most critical times in its history because of the deepening poverty levels. The gender gap in poverty has been widening. The endangering of political and human rights protections that have been eroded by authoritarian regimes. The third is, the violence against, increasing the violence against women, as well as the reduction in critical reproductive services for women. And lastly, the resistance, that it's not as if governments are free to do this without people reacting to them. There has been a marked increase in the awareness and the resistance of women joining other civil society groups to combat authoritarianism and dictatorship in the region. Thank you, Luz.
Thank you so much, Oyi, for that overview and very succinctly and very quickly. I think what Oyi brought in, and it's interesting if we're looking at how the pictures are connecting, is that governments like in the Pacific and in East Asia are not up to the task, and they're not either being not compassionate, they're being very masculine narratives, the war on COVID in East Asia, the militarization that we are seeing in Southeast Asia. And these are causing increased human rights violations across the region, and in particular affecting women who are at the most in a vulnerable situation. And I would add here, women in the LGBT community, LGBTIQ community, who are also very vulnerable in this situation. So we are seeing how some of these connections are happening. And then to continue or to complete the picture, I'd like to now invite in Farida Shahid, who is Farida Shahid, who is the Executive Director of Shirkat Gah Women's Resource Center in Pakistan. And Farida, welcome.
Thank you, and good morning and evening and afternoon to everybody here. I have one slide. Carol, if you will put up the slide, just to indicate that the entire South Asian countries, every single one of them, has been impacted by COVID. So, and it's about the same kind of, if you look at the population, the kind of instances of cases as well as deaths. We have recently seen a renewed increase in infections, which is worrying. And we now have India, which has the second highest world cases and the highest daily new cases coming in. So this is of concern, but you have spikes in Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh as well. Our testing is well below, so we really don't know how much we are coping with. There's Nepal, India, and Pakistan have just within the WHO parameters of what is needed. In terms of responses, then our governments, most of the governments in South Asia went into complete or partial lockdowns. Sri Lanka only had quarantine curfews, but the rest had lockdowns. They also restricted international and national travels, which had a huge impact in terms of women and other people's lives. And the lockdown and these measures, of course, did halt the spread of COVID. If you look at India's figures in March, they were the rate of infections were doubling, and this was brought under control but it brought its own disastrous consequences. And I suggest the World Bank is now suggesting that you have economic activity collapsing, trade, and greater stress on the financial and banking sectors as well as the economies. It's predicted that our region growth will fall to 1.8 to 2.8% versus the predicted 6.3%, and this is the worst in 40 years. And that prolonged and broad national lockdowns will then result in a negative growth for the entire region, throwing 132 million more people into extreme poverty. So that's just saying, and we're nowhere near the end of the pandemic. So the governments in South Asia, with the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, or SARC, have put together a COVID-19 emergency fund for the region, but it is completely unknown and there's no information as to how that will be used, what it will be used for, etc. Now, in terms of, we don't really need the slide anymore. People can take the photographs or screenshots and then we can just continue. As always in disasters, any kind of disasters, health or otherwise, there's been clear gender differentiated impact and other sectionalities. So all those who are vulnerable, I think Nalini has already said this, are further impacted by these situations because they exacerbate the underlying structural and systemic problems that are there. And these have not been adequately addressed. And as I think, again, Nalini probably was mentioning this, there's an absence of the women's mechanisms in the response institutions, whatever they are. In Pakistan, for instance, there is 0 women in the response mechanism. And we have also seen a lack of incorporation of local governments, whatever they are, the lowest tier, closest to the ground, who have some better aspects to cover. Okay, so I'm not going to present, the report is there and will be shared, and thank you, Sefali, I believe, has put together the South Asia one. I'm just going to pick up some areas. They are the same areas as from the other sub-regions, not surprisingly. So women in South Asia, like I guess everywhere, are concentrated in the informal, unregistered sector. Therefore, they have no protection, there's no security measures, and we're badly impacted. Home-based workers, domestic workers, B-straight workers, those in the putting out system, agricultural workers, those who are in the personal care economy. And the databases for relief provision, because governments did put forward relief, were skewered against women. So because very fewer number of women have the identity cards necessary or to be registered. And in addition to this, I just want to point out that the major focus is usually on daily wage earners and home-based and domestic workers, but there's a whole slew of women and also men, but we're concerned here with women, who have slipped quietly from white-collar backgrounds, clerk, teachers, etc., who've slipped into the poverty with very little attention. And this has been done despite, for instance, in Pakistan, there have been provincial and national directives that you cannot fire retrenched workers during this period and you must continue to pay them. In fact, this has been completely violated. It is also it is unknown whether any of the sex workers have been able to access any government funds, the transgender community, etc. And in Sri Lanka, they've noted, for instance, that while migrant workers were being brought back, the women migrant workers were not given priority for repatriation. And I think that is of concern. And then from the work that we've done here in Pakistan, for instance, the research we're doing, it's clear that adding insult to the injury or more injury to the injury of loss of jobs, a number of women who lost their jobs were then badly treated by husbands and in-laws, both in terms of violence, but also divorces, separations, etc. And I think the burden of lockdown and loss of income was experienced differently by men and women. Men lost their jobs and they also felt unable to fulfill their male role of being the breadwinner. and issues of masculinity therefore come into question. Women, in addition to whatever they were facing, had to actually physically deal with the care economy, with the men constantly and children constantly at home, and that doubled or tripled their burden of home-based work. Then you have negative coping mechanisms for this, which included selling off assets and taking loans, and who knows how they will be able to be repaid. Definitely in terms of those who have sold assets like their cattle or other assets that they may have had, bringing back that asset and capital will be very difficult. And so you're looking at longer term impacts. And we've also seen that rehiring of when businesses have reopened and rehired, they've often not rehired women. They've only rehired a smaller male force. Overall, we've seen that this is an urban phenomenon. In fact, for instance, in Nepal, large concentrations are in Kathmandu. And we also believe from the work we're doing here is that the rural areas had a slightly wider scope of resistance to this. There is, in terms of options. But there is a stigmatization, and someone spoke of that, of those who are infected, and some indications of a breakdown of community solidarity. There's the fear of the virus that has led to a distancing and an undermining of your social capital and networks, both fear of the violence, but also fear that you may be asked to help when you are unable to do so. As everywhere, the shadow pandemic that the UN Women calls it, of gender-based violence has increased. And as other speakers have said, women then trapped into the same spaces as the perpetrators of violence during lockdown was hugely problematic. And across South Asia, you had a spiking in the helpline, people running helplines, except for one, both government and non-governmental. There was a lot more digital harassment going on, so online harassment. But we have shelters that were challenged across the region because they lacked the protective gear, they lacked spaces for isolation, they did not have testing facilities. And at least one shelter here noted that the number of walk-ins that they were receiving fell to 10% compared to the usual 40 to 50% because transport was not available. Police, at least in India and Pakistan, were noted as being less responsive to cases because they were tied up with COVID-related duties. And in Pakistan, you had the courts were only hearing urgent matters, and domestic violence and family cases, which are often also related to domestic violence and abuse, were not being heard. We have to say, finally, I have to say that our experience here is that there was not just an increase in violence against women, which there was, but there was also violence by parents, women, as well as men, against children, because the children were constantly underfoot, or in some cases, women unable to vent their anger at men, then took it out on the women. There's, in India, there's some documentation of particular communities being targeted with violence as corona infected or carrying the virus. These are communities which are already targeted generally. And they found, for instance, that online counseling was extremely exhausting, and many of the online helplines were not really prepared for the level of counseling and the level of moral support that they needed to do. In terms of child early age marriage, it is unknown whether they really had an effect, but certainly there is a question of education, which I'll come to. The third area is health. Health, of course, has been identified here, but there were two ways. One, the bulk, as elsewhere, of frontline workers, as we heard from East Asia in the health field, especially in terms of outreach workers, nurses, etc., are female, who were then not provided the protective gear or the required level of gear, exposing them to hierarchies. And we have very strong hierarchies of class and status here, so the lower down people were just not looked after, and also have an insecurity of jobs. The second area is really healthcare for any other issue other than COVID became a problem. But especially we looked at pregnant women who were unable to get anti and postnatal checkups, and many outpatient services were closed or only seeing people at a distance, so no physical examination. And in the end, this pandemic is really threatening to undermine many of the gains made in the area of reproductive health in recent years. Contraceptive supplies, both within the country and those that were coming from outside, were disrupted when international travel and the closure of international airports. And as Nalini said, in the Pacific, we are experiencing, we are sure we will experience a spike in the number of births as well as out of institution deliveries. I think one thing I do want to share here, which does not usually come to light, is that in Pakistan at least, there are some institutions, government institutions, which are receiving 3 to 4 times the number of women coming for post-abortion care, which suggests they are self-medicating or using unsafe methods because they only come when there is a problem. And the mental health stress was huge, but only one province responded with putting up a helpline. We don't know if it was useful or not. And here I want to flag something we need to think about. Increasingly, there's talk about telehealth, telemedicine, long distance counseling, et cetera, but there are at least 2 major issues here. One, very few, if any, of the countries have a robust policy or legal framework to govern this new area. So people are doing online counseling, but what about the question of privacy? What about the question of quality, et cetera? None of this has really been worked out. And secondly, women in general have far less access to telephones, smartphones, computers, et cetera, to be able to avail of this, which comes to my other area of media and the digital connectivity. I think it's, as everyone talks about, new normals being online rather than face-to-face, at least for the next couple of years. It's to be noted that women in South Asia are 26% less likely to own a mobile. And furthermore, they have more limited service packages than men, and often don't have smartphones. And also the usage of their phones may actually be controlled by family men. This restricts information, it restricts access to services. And I think this is something we need to think about, especially as we have work from home being promoted as a model for safer operations, business operations. And that brings me to the area of education. The lockdowns, of course, 40 of the 40 million children who are affected by the closure of schools, 22 million, that's the majority, are based in South Asia. And the impact of this is further marginalizing the already marginalized. You have educational institutions which are mainly your privileged schools, private schools, higher education institutions, which switch to online classes. But online classes themselves have excluded those who are disadvantaged to begin off with, who don't have the devices or have poor or no internet connectivity or the space to work at home, or they don't have electricity for much of the time. And this problem may persist as protocols, for instance, in Pakistan, when schools reopened, they had to be reshut because the protocols were not being followed, and students and teachers testing positive exceeded the 2% acceptable level. There is also talk of hybrid classes in the future, but online classes are already placing a burden on women. As Aurora also mentioned, the working women who are trying to work at home and at the same time are trying to ensure that their children are also following online. Then if women are not digitally literate, which many of our women in South Asia are not, they are unable to help their children. So I think this is a big issue. Plus, when you are in an economic issue, when you're having an economic crunch, will girls go back to school? So this is just to finish. Yes, Luce, I know I'm running out of time, but I will just wanted to share some of the positive examples that I see across the region. And I think one of the things that the women's organizations have done and deserve kudos for, is gathering information and following what is happening to women and other marginalized communities. And they're also have been providing relief and ensuring that women-headed households, those who are marginalized, sex workers, home-based workers, domestic workers, are included in the relief packages. And I think you have data collection, and sometimes this is with resources, and sometimes this is without resources, as women's organizations are poorly funded. You have the LNC in India, for instance, which focuses on shelter services for survivors, and they've done research on that. And there's Shirkaka working with the UN Women here to do a rapid assessment. These are examples, there's others. I think there's wonderful policy work being done by the Feminist Policy Collective in India. And others are also engaging with the government, trying their best to ensure that you have a gendered perspective. And at the end, I think one of the best things is the women in their own neighborhoods we've seen have really helped each other in very poor circumstances, in difficult, trying circumstances. And we need to learn from their solidarity. Some of the other things is providing messages on how to manage your stress, and how reaching out by men to men as well as women to say that violence is not the solution. So I think in the end, I just want to say that I think this is an opportunity, as several people have said, to rethink. We need to rethink how we think about development. We need to ensure that you have security, social security systems and protection for all workers, regardless of who and how they are employed, which is not the case right now. We need to document and register all workers before we can do that. We need to examine which pots of money exist in the governments in order to use this for relief and to put it to the side. Grants need to be provided to women's groups, and they need to invest in local community women's groups in particular. Disaggregated, accurate data is missing, and we need to try and push for that. We need to ensure that gender-based violence response mechanisms are all declared essential services and never shut down in any kind of emergencies, and that violence against women, as well as family cases, are included in urgent matters for all courts. And I think at the end of the day, two other things, sorry. One is that we need to move away from the silos of planning. And one thing that's been stressed here is that you absolutely need to have to address gender-based violence, you need to have at least the social welfare department, population department, health department, police enforcement, all working together because they all have a role and they never do this. And you need far greater training of how to recognize the symptoms and how to respond to this. And finally, we need to ensure that you have the formalized mechanisms for women's organizations, for women departments or institutions to be included in the planning and review and decision-making of what's happening. And I think in the end, to me, the Beijing platform, because Luz asked us this question, to me, the Beijing platform really does give, in terms of the UN, the most feminist perspective of what is the problem structurally, and we need to see how we can move forward on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Farida. I will not even attempt to do a summary because I think you summarized it in an excellent way. You brought in new issues of ethical issues of counseling, the rollbacks that we are experiencing, the old issues that we thought we had resolved that show that we have not resolved them, so we need to go back to them. And the most important thing is that women are doing things, women know what needs to be done, and we need to be involved and brought in into the different processes. So before I go into the question and answer, I'd like to add one more thing that was brought in from Kin Hla from Hala, I think it's how you pronounce your name, Kin. Kin, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, from Myanmar. And she'd like to include a little bit more information on Myanmar, where she says, women are doubly jeopardized facing conflicts and COVID-19 together. While the Myanmar is focusing on tackling a pandemic, women from conflict affected areas are still suffering from the conflict and lockdowns and the cut in transportation, where women cannot go out looking for food, water, and participate in daily wage generation. Due to the outbreak of COVID in the context of conflicts, the vulnerability of women increases. So thank you very much for bringing in that perspective, or that point, that women in situations of conflict are very vulnerable at this time, more so than even before. So I'd like to now go into the questions, and we have a question from Mavic, and I think Mavic Bayesa, and so I will not read the whole question, but basically her question is, we already heard there are no women in the structures or mechanisms, the power structure mechanisms on addressing the pandemic. And so her question is, why are there no women in these mechanisms? Why are women missing at this level? So maybe a couple of you can answer that. Maybe Yukiko, you can tell us from East Asia, why are women missing at the table for addressing the pandemic?
Thank you for this the opportunity. I think there are many reasons, especially considering Japan at the very bottom of the world economic forum's the chart that we are on 120th or out of 153. The major reason is the very small number of women in political decision-making position. But saying that this is particularly this time, when we talk about this, the COVID, the experts are more kind of the expert of the health and also pandemic. So in Japan, particularly in Japan, but might be the similar case in other countries, that women in the science and technology field is not enough. So therefore, sometimes the opportunity is not given to those, the priority is given to people who are more expert of that area. So STEM, that science and technology and what's it? Engineering and mathematics, that this area is, I think that is the area where we need to explore as if we talk about this pandemic.
Thank you. Anyone else want to answer why women are not at the table?
I can say from Pakistan very specifically, because it's the National Disaster Management Authority that does this, which is basically the armed forces. And women are not in the armed forces sufficiently to be in the decision making. So the response of the federal government has been in that way, and down to you don't have women, sufficient number of women in representative governments that could have an influence on this. And as I said, women are more in the local government, and the local government was excluded from the decision making, which is very top down.
Okay.
Okay, Luz?
Yeah, Oi?
Yeah. Well, I'll speak specifically in the Philippines. It is a policy not to include women. The government simply has a policy of not excluding women from major decisions. There are women who are, of course, the only qualification that you should have is that you are pro the president, and that you will not oppose the government. So anyone else who's critical at all at any level will be, booted out of her position. So we find a very curious position at least in the Philippines and in other Southeast Asian countries, that they give priority to the participation of military people, no? And that therefore at the decision-making level, you have military people thinking whose approach is very militaristic, and therefore have turned a public health issue into a security issue. Okay, and that they're added to that is of course the current misogynist treatment of women in both the language as well as in the behavior, and even in the policies dealing with COVID. So experts like who are former health secretaries, or who are really in the know about this, are marginalized. So you have military people making all the decisions on a public health issue. So that to me is the uh, is the problem. And we know that when the military takes over, they often exclude women. I haven't seen any military task force that included women at all. So it's a major problem, because by excluding women, they don't get the benefit of the experience, the perspective, and the expertise of most women who have done this work for the longest time. And so you are depriving the country of much needed expertise. And as I said, having said that, also that there is no particular attention given to the specific needs of women. That's also the problem.
Yes, yes.
Liz, if I may.
Good, go ahead.
Just two things. One being, we know in the midst or aftermath of any type of disaster, whether it is natural disaster, or in this case, it's a public health related a safety disaster. Women are always at the community level, family level, national level. Women are one of we are the first to come out and put our heads together for that compassionate approach to ensure that services will be delivered, the humanitarian relief efforts will be delivered. And so it's been the same here in Fiji. It's women's rights organization, women-headed organization who are leading this, with our Minister for Women being very having a very compassionate approach as well. However, when it comes to looking at the more structural responses, then yes, because of the attitudes that have been mentioned earlier on, women are not on the table, and all our perspectives, are then dismissed. And the other thing is, in this is evident in my country, in Fiji, and I would suppose perhaps in others as well. This move towards a gender neutral approaches, are not to favor one over the other. But we all know that a gender neutral approach does not mean that it's gender responsive. So when we are looking at, from the way in which all government institutions, ministries, departments, etc., the way they are interacting with how they should be addressing singular issues intersecting with the pandemic, then we do not see, any type of differentiated response coming in that could help women or those that are most affected in the way it should be. And this is directly linked with not having women in those circles where those discussions and decisions are being made.
Absolutely true. I have another question here, and this is on mental health. This is from Mel Reyes, and she is pointing out that women are experiencing depression and at alarming rates, and there are mental health issues, and that these mental health issues among women and girls can also impact on their economic viability, politics, engagement in politics, and in other fields. What are you seeing in your regions on the issue of mental health?
I think from South Asia, very quickly, I don't actually have details from all the countries, but in general, we have health systems, public health systems, which are grossly under-resourced. So just to begin with, and within that, then mental health issues, one, it's stigmatized, it continues to be stigmatized, and therefore people feel they can't go there. And secondly, we just don't have enough people who are dealing with this. So we don't have enough psychologists, we don't have enough psychosocial people who are aware of and can help in these situations, which is why some of our groups here in Pakistan, for instance, sent out little video clips through WhatsApp, through telephones, on how do you manage stress. You are in the middle of a stressful situation and lockdown. And we had people who are psychologists who then told us some coping mechanisms. Only one province put up a mental health, mental stress helpline, but I don't know how many people used it. The outcome is not known, but at least the government, one of the provincial governments, recognized that this was a huge issue. Late, but they did recognize it. And I think it's something that proactively, at least in South Asia, people think this is something to be not talked about. It has so much stigma attached to it.
Yes.
Can I say something?
Sure.
The Ruth?
Yes, yes, you can.
Okay, there, I think there. I don't. We haven't has the case. We don't know about other countries in East Asia, but as far as I know about Japan, there is that we are worrying about the number of suicide has been dramatically, sharply increased after, particularly last several months, and among them the young women, the number of young women of suicide has been sharper than other group of people. So therefore, we are worrying about what is that. That the number is data is reviewed very recently, so we don't know the reason yet. But analysis has not been done yet. But this is something we are worrying about the situation.
Yeah. Clearly
Thank
an
you.
area for more research. I mean, if there's
Yeah.
any funders out there listening, this is an area where we need some more research. I have a last question here, and this one is for Nalini in particular. Nalini, this is from Mel Reyes, and she says that as women are working more from home, working online from home, she's wondering if there's any policy or programmatic actions on the part of your government in relation to a more specific guidelines regarding the work from home setup, which can include, among others, social protection and other benefits for women who are in this kind of employment, and which could be the legal basis of the companies or organizations in this modality.
Very interesting question. And I have to say, no, we don't have any of that. We have not even moved that far. So for Fiji, as I was explaining, because we are COVID contained, meaning that we don't have community transmissions. The schools are open and workplaces are open, and most we're back in our offices doing the work that we do. It's tourism related employment that is most affected, and in industries that export and import, because the airports and airlines are impacted. But this is a very good question, because there was a period of time when the two major cities went into lockdown at different periods of time. And there was a situation where most of us non-essential service providers or workers were asked to work from home. And the government sort of did not have any special guidelines or protections put into place. It basically, what we know for a fact is different organizations had their own guidelines in relation to, well, how do we provide for safety, security, how do we provide for leave, just in case one of our colleagues or we get infected by the virus and we need to go on prolonged leave and all of that. All of that sort of happened by different organizations. Now, interestingly enough, and this is not in relation to the state, but and this happened worldwide, was that health insurance companies then or those that provide insurance when we travel, etc. They began to eliminate or add in clauses into their insurance policies to say that they were not going to cover any health related evacuation or even treatment, etc., related costs to COVID. So that did put us into a little bit of a dilemma because all our colleagues were in the same situation, and then we had to say, well, let's take extra precautions and keep safe as best as we can, because if we do contract the virus, then it'll be quite costly because there was going to be no other way of paying for it. So I have to say that there's a lot of lessons learned when we are talking about the kinds of issues that you have raised. And it's a very interesting question. And one, Luz, I think that should be parked for further study because it's a good lesson learned from this time.
Absolutely. And on that note, we've already gone over time. I would like to bring the webinar to a close, but to point out that the issues are definitely go beyond the 12 critical issues. We see that they're all interrelated, and the solutions also need to be in this connected way. We cannot accept that we are put into quadrants of only 4 or 5 issues, because the issues are not easily met into 4 or 5, and we need to tackle them in a more comprehensive and holistic way. I want to thank everyone for joining and staying with us for as long as you have, and would like to encourage you that this is an ongoing process of gathering data and information. We have just started this pandemic. This will take a toll on us for many more months to come. And if you have any information, research, data, if it's in English, please share it with us. I think that the slide here will show where you can send it to, the APWW email address. And we hope to continue hearing from you. We will leave the chat for a few more minutes open for those of you who would like to continue asking questions or engaging with us. I see that we have a very interesting group of participants with us today. So thank you very much. Thank you to Nalini, to Yukiko, to Oyi, and to Farida for your time and this very, very interesting and comprehensive overview. Thank you, everyone.